Congratulations on your new book. It's a fantastic read. I'm not a fast reader, but I could not stop. It really turned into a drama. It pulled me along.
It really was a mind-blowing experience to learn how to write a completely new genre. You found it read like a drama. A memoir should whisk people away into a story where they feel like they're part of it. They're going up and down on the roller coaster with the main character, that's the author, and experiencing those feelings and the tension and everything else with her.
Do you have a thirst to learn about wine? Do you love stories about wonderfully obsessive people, hauntingly beautiful places, and amusingly awkward social situations? Well, that's the blend here on the Unreserved Wine Talk podcast. I'm your host, Natalie McLean, and each week I share with you unfiltered conversations with celebrities in the wine world, as well as confessions from my own tipsy journey as I write my third book on this subject. I'm so glad you're here. Now pass me that bottle, please, and let's get started. Welcome to episode 240. How do you deal with the mob mentality of social media when it's part of your work? How can you find humor in the dark moments of life? And what has changed in the past 10 years in the wine industry when it comes to inequality and discrimination? In today's episode, you'll hear the stories and tips that answer those questions and more in my chat with Luke Whittall on the Sipster's Wine Podcast. Luke is the author of 4 books, including The Pocket Guide to 50 Must-Try BC Wines. He's also a wine instructor at Okanagan College. Luke is interviewing me on his podcast. Now, a quick update on my memoir, Wine Witch on Fire, Rising from the Ashes of Divorce, Defamation, and Drinking Too Much. In yesterday's National Post, the critic, Pat St. Germain, reviewed the book, quote, "A few truly icky sexist pigs won't have any trouble identifying themselves in award-winning wine writer Natalie McLean's memoir. Neither will you." She names names. McLean faced down those trolls, then got on with her remarkably successful life. The book isn't about revenge, but hey, doesn't living well make for a nice finish? End quote. I love that play on finish. So I'll link to the full review in the show notes. By the way, many readers, including many men, have mentioned in their reviews that this memoir is not a rant against all men. Here's a review from Suzanne Garrett, who lives in Lee's Summit, Missouri. Quote, "I had read so many reviews of this book online that I thought I'd try it out for myself. I'm so glad I did. No, this isn't a man-hater book, though there are challenges that we as women have had to face. There are also lots of interesting facts about wine I never knew." End quote. I call out only a few individuals in the book. Several people ask me why I use the real names of the men who were involved in the online mobbing. Well, at first, I had actually changed all of their names as I didn't want to give them more attention in the book. That's the oxygen that trolls live on. However, after several lawyers reviewed the manuscript, they told me that if I quoted what these men said without using their real names, I would be violating their copyright. Now, that would be ironic in a book about misunderstanding copyright. So I used their real names. And I believe now that they deserve full credit for what they said and did. Meanwhile, Toronto Life magazine published an in-depth interview about the book with this provocative lead-in, quote, "The longtime Enid-file dishes on her candid memoir that documents her dealings with sexism, alcoholism, and nasty competition inside the tight-knit wine and wine-drinking industry," end quote. Is it also ironic that the magazine's wine columnist was one of the men named in the book? Who knows? I mean, sometimes I just have to throw my hands up in the air. Toronto Life posted the story on Facebook, and there's been a lot of interesting comments on it. I'll link to that in the show notes, as you're welcome to weigh in with your own thoughts. If you've read the book, I'd love to hear from you at natalie@nataliemclean.com. If you haven't got your copy yet and would like to support it and this podcast, please order it from any online book retailer, no matter where you live. Every little bit helps spread the message of hope, justice, and truth in the book. I'll put a link in the show notes to all retailers worldwide at nataliemclean.com/240. 240. Okay, on with the show.
This week's conversation is a biggie. Natalie MacLean is one of Canada's most recognizable wine personalities. She's appeared regularly on TV, newspapers, and magazine columns, as well as online through her website. She has written 2 other books previously that I know you've seen in the wine sections of bookstores before. Red, White, and Drunk All Over, a wine-soaked journey from grape to glass, and then Unquenchable, a tipsy quest for the world's best bargain wines. Her new book is called Wine Witch on Fire, Rising from the Ashes of Divorce, Defamation, and Drinking Too Much. It's a memoir, and it's out now and available everywhere. But she is offering some juicy bonuses if you buy the book on her website at winewitchonfire.com. So how did she find out about my little podcast? I asked her actually about this, and apparently somebody, as an early preview reader of her book, suggested my name to her. And so I woke up one morning about a month ago with an email from Natalie herself. So thank you to whoever it is that suggested me. That's really nice of you. So she sent me a PDF copy of her book, and honestly, I was hooked. It was a really gripping read and bravely deals with a lot of really heavy topics, ones that most wine books would never touch and frankly actively avoid talking about them altogether. This includes things like divorce, obviously, which is in the title, but also alcohol abuse, sexuality, misogyny, and online bullying. These are all themes in this memoir, and it makes it very relatable to people and on a lot of different levels. So, of course, there's wine tidbits sprinkled all through the book, which is, wine is a part of her life, and so it's going to be a part of the memoirs as well, too, of course. So here we go. My conversation with Natalie MacLean. Enjoy. Thank you for being a guest on the Sipsters podcast. This is really cool. And congratulations on your new book. It's a fantastic read. I'm not a fast reader, but I could not stop. And you call it a memoir. And I started thinking, when I read it, I thought of it as a memoir, but it really turned into a drama. I mean, it really kind of reads like a drama. And I'm not saying that in a sort of, drama kind of way. It's really fascinating. Like, for me anyways, it pulled me along. And so I forgot that, it is actually a memoir in that way.
And I love to hear when people say that, memoir does have to be true, but it shares more in common with fiction than nonfiction. So my first 2 books, Red, White, and Drunk All Over, Unquenchable, were nonfiction books about wine and traveling around the world. This one is also true, but the techniques I had to develop made it a completely different animal writing-wise. So, fiction, what's important in fiction? Plot, character development, narrative arc, conflict, resolution, all the story beats. And I felt like by the time we had finished all the edits on this, 97 of them, I felt like I got a mini...
I got off light with my last book. Damn.
Well, I'm just obsessive too. It's mostly me, not the editors. It's like, if I had my choice or my preference, I'd be running after the manuscript on its way to the printer going, just one more thing. But it really was a mind-blowing kind of experience to try to learn how to write like this, a completely new genre. So I'm glad, circling back to your comment, that you found like it read like a drama, because it should. A memoir should. It sticks to the truth, but it should, whisk people away into a story where they feel like they're part of it. They're going up and down on the roller coaster with the narrator, the main character, that's the author, and experiencing those feelings and the tension and everything else with her.
Maybe at this point, for listeners who are not aware of what happened, can you recap the things that happened in 2012? I mean, it was early on in social media. And I know for me, because I do remember when this happens. And as I was reading it, I'm like, wait a minute. I remember the original incident being there. And I believe I actually made a comment on there too in one of the early stages. And I know that the comment was taken down. And I really hope I wasn't adding any fuel to that fire, because I know that for me personally, I was fresh off of my own battle of trying to get one of these content sites to take down stuff that they were using for mine. Do you remember they had those little aggregator things that people would put tweets, and it was like, the Realtor Daily is now out and click here. And it wasn't like a big site like that. It was just one of these little services. And they were everywhere, and I always found them really annoying. And somebody was taking a lot of the stuff that I was doing. So I just had like a big set of emails with them, not anything in public, but just, and I remember hearing about this and going, well, let's find out more about it. And I think I posted something, but I don't remember what it was or anything like that. But do you think people might have been a little bit heightened about that kind of thing at that point? I mean, as you said, there was no guardrails for that kind of thing in social media at that point.
As you say, there were a lot of content aggregators. I actually didn't quoting the reviews from the government site, the LCBO in Ontario, until I got another Google alert a year earlier, where another wine site had been quoting my reviews on their site. So the idea to do this didn't actually come to me until that Google alert popped up, and I thought, okay, well, a couple things. It must be okay because no one's saying anything about this. They're quoting it from a government site, must be in the public domain. That was also wrong. Yeah. And they haven't asked me, so it must be kosher. And so since I'm a glass half full kind of woman, not the other way, I didn't approach them to remove my wine reviews. Instead, I just started quoting the reviews from the government site as well.
That's just how things sort of rolled at that point, it seemed.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I've become certainly more educated about this. But, you know, the amount of time we spent on that particular question or issue, and as I said, I just ended up deleting any reviews for my own from my site, was like a tiny percentage of this whole thing in terms of how it spiraled. And it spiraled
pretty quick.
It did. Yeah. It did. Now, you know, from South Africa to New York, it was everywhere on websites, in newspapers. It just took on its own life. And, you know, people talk about wanting their post to go viral. This is not the way you want.
Yeah, this is not what they mean when they say that. So now, other than, I know Jancis Robinson weighed in. I don't know when that was, though, but you did mention that. Were there any other female writers that were involved in either spearheading the initial approach, or was it largely male? And then did you get support in any way when they realized that, hey, this is not about the original issue anymore? This is now something, this is very different, and this is an attack.
Yeah, it was almost all men. I can't remember a woman commenting on that blog post in the comments section. And Jancis emailed, she didn't comment on that blog. She emailed in response to another male writer who had emailed her and copied more than 30 editors and writers around the world about the reviews, even after I'd fixed them. So there was no acknowledgement that I was actually fixing them. So she gets an email and it looks like, oh my God, what's happening? And so she just replied to the email. And then I replied to her saying I was, you know, already in the process of removing all the reviews, not even trying to fix, because there is such a thing as fair use. You can quote other reviews. So, but it was so beyond that, I didn't even want to go there.
Well, like when you say that you were fixing it, this isn't like just sort of adding in a search tool and going, you know, find and replace and delete all this stuff. This is actually like hard work going through every single post. You know, is that what that is? I mean, this is 10 years ago now, so the technology wasn't quite the same to be able to do this kind of stuff. Was this like a months-long project to do this?
Yeah, I had to do this by hand to edit it. And that was fine. I accepted that responsibility, but there was just no room to wait for a response, even though I'd said, this is what's happening already. Yeah. And just, you know, give me time to get these all off. No one wanted to wait for that. Or these commenters did not want to wait for that.
It just didn't seem it was happening fast enough for them. But again, it wasn't really the point, I guess, in some ways, too.
Not after the fact. Yeah. They had moved of that because that issue was resolved. Like, what were they left to deal with? Well, it was just going after me individually.
I've always found that social media, and this is something I was not comfortable with early on, but nobody was really talking about it around that time. But I've always found, and I did a podcast about this a couple of weeks ago, about social media not really lining up for me personally with my values. And so there's a bit of a sort of group mentality or a mob kind of mentality that happens with social media. And in some ways that can come for some interesting things, like Dan Albus, the member of Parliament for Penticton here, who was able to get through Bill C-311 in Parliament later in June in 2013. He called it the Twitterati when I spoke to him about it, because, you know, a lot of people on social media really got behind that bill. and were very public, tagging other members of parliament and things like that to get this bill passed, which he credited with, helping to get that bill passed. But in doing that, are we, as social media kind of unleashed this kind of easy peasy mob and squeezy, and that doesn't make sense, but you know what I mean? Like, does it release that kind of, or does that bring that out in us more? And does it still happen? I mean, it did then clearly, but does that still happen now, do you think?
Absolutely. Like, there's both pro and con to social media. I think increasingly we're seeing the dark side, whether it's young girls, responding to Instagram and the problems they're having with self-image, or the pylons. Brighter aspects, social media can be a force for good, like changing a bill that needs to be changed, or giving voice to people who are oppressed in a regime that will not allow for free speech. But too often, social media and free speech are used as excuses to say anything about anyone that you like and hide behind it as an unknown or as a, cloaked with your identity. People don't have to stand up and be responsible for what they say. They say things they would never say to someone in person. Yeah. And so social media is a really mixed bag, but I've learned to manage it because I think everyone has to manage social media if you're on it for the sake of your own mental health, whether that's blocking negative accounts, just not reading certain streams, choosing wisely which channels or which platforms that, on which you're going to participate. Everyone has to make their choices, including how much time you want to spend on social media, because that's the big thief for all of us. I mean, you've probably heard this. If you're not paying for something, then you are the product. They are selling our attention spans, our eyeballs, our time. And that's, I think, one of the greatest losses that we all have when it comes to social media.
Yeah. Yeah. Has anything changed in that time? I mean, it's been 10, almost 11 years now since this. Do you see any changes in that? And I mean, there are positive things like Me Too wouldn't have come out without social media. But is there any change, or are we now largely accepting of that kind of dynamic happening and now assume that it happens or it could happen?
Yeah, I think we've become numbed. So I don't know if that's a good thing, in that if you get a pylon, it's perhaps, I don't know, not the end of your career, although it still can feel like it. But I think in terms of what changed, especially if we look at the wine world, in comparison, the restaurant industry is far more organized and has had a greater awareness of these issues publicized, with, sexual harassment by celebrity chefs exposed. But I think the wine industry is much smaller and less formal. Most wineries in Canada and the U.S. have fewer than, 20 people working there, and most don't have an HR department, let alone a harassment policy. And, even when there is one, it's often not communicated well to employees. As you know, Luke, the entry-level winemaking sommelier positions, they're apprenticeships. They're usually one-on-one with a mentor. These employees, entry-level employees, are often young, so there's a power imbalance. They're highly dependent on their mentor for their next job and a referral. So these power differentials can be easily manipulated. Most of them aren't, but it creates an environment where they easily can be. And even a 2018 survey of UK hospitality people said 89% of female workers had been experienced on-the-job sexual harassment. And that doesn't include other forms of power abuse. Wow. And as you know, in 2020, the New York Times published Julia Moskin's scathing multi-page of the wine industry's rampant sexism. That's 2020, only a couple years ago, with 21 women reporting they had been sexually harassed, manipulated, and assaulted by male master sommeliers. The fallout was swift, but so the awareness is increasing, but the short answer is yes, that's changed, but a lot still needs to be done.
The fallout was swift from the Court of Master Sommeliers, but then we haven't really heard about it very much over the last couple of years either.
No, it's sort of died down, and I don't know what's happening now, so I can't comment on that, but,
Yeah, it's interesting. Interesting how that happens. So after going through your experiences, I'm always curious for writers, and this is maybe less a wine question, more a writing question now, but has your written voice changed as a result of doing this? I mean, it's a memoir. You wrote about wine for years, and this is already, that was a little bit different, but do you approach things differently now than you did before? And has it changed the way that you do, sort of, for lack of a better expression, transcribe your thoughts into text?
Sure. Well, I think it does blend wine and writing. You know, humor has always been my way of dealing with tough times. And maybe that comes from my Celtic roots, because I think, as we talked about, we need to find levity even in darker moments. You know, I remember the comment at one funeral of one of my deceased relatives, and someone said he's still showing up late. And I don't want to trivialize the serious subjects in this book, in Wine Witch on Fire, but we need comic relief in life, in writing, everywhere.
Sorry, have you used your air miles yet?
You're referring to my epitaph, you know, because you get air miles based on wine purchases. So in the book, I say, you know, I probably have 300,000 air miles based on wine purchases. On my tombstone, it would say, too bad she expired before they did. No, not.
That's the thing. It's kind of a dark humor that you use in this, which is fantastically funny. I find it funny, but, you know, that's just me.
Well, good. You're my people. But I always say, well, you know, given that, you know, the subtitle of this book is brought to you by all the dismal letter Ds, it's rising from the ashes of divorce, defamation, and drinking too much. My publisher's marketing team insisted we take out depression, destitution, delirium. They said, we're not going to be able to sell this book. No, I'm kidding. But it is, for all that, it is a hopeful book. There is a lot of humor in it. But I think what's changed for me is that my humor used to be very quippy, you know, and red, white, and drunk all over. It was kind of a defense mechanism for keeping people out and not revealing my feelings. And now I hope I have a gentler approach both to humor and writing that lets people in, you know, with maybe a softer chuckle.
You use it more as a deflection than before.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And with the lens of time, you know, I can step back. They say comedy is pain plus time. So with time, I've been able to stand back and see some of the more absurd things that happen that do border on comical. Now, someone reading this book for the first time might think, oh my gosh, how can you inject humor there, even though they do appreciate it? But that's because they're reading the book for the first time, whereas I've had that benefit of 10 years to look back and say, here's what I learned. Here's what I can recognize now as bizarre, both in terms of my own behavior and others. Here's where it doesn't make sense. And so that it all comes together. So I'd say that's a very important piece of how things have changed since writing this book.
That's amazing. That's really cool.
Well, there you have it. I hope you enjoyed my chat with Luke. In the show notes, you'll find the full transcript of my conversation with him, links to his website, books, and podcast, the video versions of these conversations on Facebook and YouTube Live, where you can order my memoir online, no matter where you live, and that controversial Toronto Life magazine interview that I mentioned at the beginning of the episode. That's all in the show notes at nataliemaclean.com/240. Email me if you have a sip, tip, or question at natalie@nataliemaclean.com. If you missed episode 9, go back and take a listen. I chat with Ezra Sipes of BC's Summerhill Winery about whether vegan and vegetarian wines are better for you. I'll share a short clip with you now to whet your appetite.
Our vineyard in Kelowna is certified by Demeter as a biodynamic vineyard. It has extra rules above and beyond organic. So organic is sort of the baseline, which means that there's no synthetics being used, basically. And then there's guidance on things they want to see about soil preservation and biodiversity and things like that. But biodynamics really codifies that. You have to have at least 10% of your farm given over to nature habitat. And we have, I think, about 20 or 25% of our farms. That's wetland, we have a dry land, we have a meadow habitat. And then you really view the farm as an ecosystem. You integrate animals and animal manures, and you really focus on making your own fertilizers from things you grow on the farm. We make a horsetail tea for mildew control. We make large amounts of compost, and we add these herbal preparations to the compost to aid processes of decomposition. We spray basically a bacterial broth all over the farm that aids the life force, if you will, in the soil, but basically the soil food web.
If you like this episode, please email or tell one friend about it this week, especially someone you'd know who'd be interested in the wines, tips, and stories we shared. You won't want to miss next week when I continue my chat with Luke. Thank you for taking the time to join me here. I hope something great is in your glass this week. Perhaps a wine that makes going online a little bit more palatable. You don't want to miss one juicy episode of this podcast, especially the secret, full-bodied bonus episodes that I don't announce on social media. So, subscribe for free now at nataliemclean.com/subscribe. Meet me here next week. Cheers.